Hey demons, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor, and for today's video I am going through all of the books that I read in July. July was a really good reading month for me. I participated in 2 different readathons. I did the Horror in 24 readathon, and then I also did the Pop Culture readathon, and I did the Thrill Ride board for that readathon. I ended up reading 12 and a half books, and I'm really happy to say that I really loved most of the books that I read this month. I read a ton of new releases, and then I also read a bunch of horror and fantasy, so probably the reason why I had such a great reading month. But without further ado, let's get started, and I will be going from my least favorite book of the month to my favorite book of the month. So starting off with a book that I did read for the 90s Pop Culture Readathon. I read it for the prompt, The Mummy, Read a Book with the Undead. I read The Suicide Motor Club by Christopher Buehlman, and if this had been written by anyone else, or if it hadn't been one of my books that I was going to be reading for a readathon, I probably would have DNF'd to this. This just did not connect with me. It's about a young woman whose family is murdered by vampires, and her and a bunch of other people who have had the same situation band together to try and take vengeance on the vampires that killed their family members. I have read one other thing by Christopher Buehlman before, and I really loved it. It was one of my favorite books of I believe last year. That is why I kept really pushing through this one, hoping that it might get better, but this one it didn't connect with me. The story itself was good, but it was a different writing style, and I didn't connect with any of the characters. And if you are looking to pick up a really good vampire book, I would highly suggest The Lesser Dead by Christopher Buehlman. That was a wonderful book by this author. This one was just a complete miss for me. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Shadows by Alex North, and I read this for the Pop Culture Readathon, and this was for the prompt, Everybody's a Suspect, Read a Mystery or Thriller. This is a thriller about a group of boys who try and connect each other's dreams. So they try and lucid dream and connect with each other in the dreams. Something goes horribly wrong and there's a murder. The main character leaves the town and goes back years and years later to take care of his ailing mother, and discovers that there is a copycat killer on the loose, which is strange because the original killer, one of his childhood friends, vanished completely. Is thought to be sort of a supernatural Bloody Mary creature. So there's 2 different timelines here, and it was kind of marketed as a book that had very Bloody Mary kind of urban legend elements to it, and had like a paranormal thriller vibe. The part that I thought that was most exciting about this whole premise was the fact that the boys were linking up together in this dream world and kind of exploring lucid dreaming, and also exploring like sleep paralysis, because those are real life things that can get very creepy. That really wasn't explored in here. This is a very short book, and there are 2 different timelines, 2 different narrators, and I felt like I understand why we needed a second timeline because of that whole copycat killer, but the second timeline felt like a lot of telling and no showing, while the first timeline was actually like a narrative. I haven't read The Whisper Man, but judging by some Goodreads reviews, a lot of people that did read and really enjoy The Whisper Man have a lot of the same complaints that I do with this book. It did feel very rushed. I feel like we could have added another 100 pages easy to this, just because the first timeline is really interesting. There's a lot of creepy thrillery stuff going on, and then the second timeline, there's no urgency. It's just the main character, whose name is Paul. He's going around from person to person, and they will just monologue and tell him the information that he needs to know. So unfortunately, this wasn't my favorite book of the month, even though I was really looking forward to it. But I still might pick up another book by Alex North in the future, just because I have heard really good things about The Whisper Man, and the general consensus is that The Whisper Man is a lot better than this book. The next book I'm going to talk about is Sky Without Stars by Jessica Brody and Joanne Rendell. I also read this for the 90s Pop Culture Readathon. This is a Les Mis retelling, but it is in space. It's a futuristic world where our Earth has become no longer inhabitable. So survivors from Earth go to different planets, and different regimes are established. Much like France during the time of Les Mis, this is not a pleasant planet to live on unless you are part of the 1%. So this is the start of a revolution. There are 3 main protagonists. Shatine is a street savvy thief. life, and she is kind of living for herself. She doesn't like the order, but she doesn't really feel called to fight against it. She's just trying to survive and maybe escape off the planet to create a better life for herself. There's Marcellus, and he is an officer in this oppressive regime, and he discovers that maybe everything is not idyllic as propaganda from the state leads him to believe. And then the third point of view is Alouette, and she is living in an underground refuge with some rebels. So this was a very enjoyable book. I don't know if I'm going to be continuing on with the series just because this is YA, so to me I felt like a lot of it could have been better explained, or a lot of topics just could be better explored through an adult novel. I just felt like the characters were very young at times, which is fine. Young people can change the future, but there are definitely some plot points where I feel like even as a musical, Les Mis explored the emotional trauma of something like this happening a whole lot more than this. And I just felt like for most of the book, I was kind of waiting for it to go to that extra level, go to that next step of just being a little bit darker. I do think this is a good book. I wouldn't say that that is a fault of this by any means. It is YA, so you can't really go balls to the wall dark with it still being classified as a YA. This was one of the best retellings of Les Mis that I have read before. One of the bigger problems as well was I really enjoyed one of the points of view and I didn't really care for the other two. They weren't bad points of view to read from, but I found myself really trying to push through their points of view to get to that third point of view that I enjoyed. So this is a very large book. It is going to be at least a trilogy, so I don't know how much of my time would be well spent reading such a large expanse of books if I only really care about one of the main characters. That being said, I just don't think that I was the right target audience for this book. I think for like my 13-year-old sister who really loves musicals, would really like Les Mis, would enjoy this retelling, I think it would be a lot more up her alley. So I don't know if I'll be continuing on with this series, but I did enjoy my time reading it. The next book that I read, this is for the Horror in 24 readathon, and that was Read Your Favorite Childhood Spooky Story. And for that one, I read Tales of Mystery and Madness. These are 4 Edgar Allan Poe short stories, and they're illustrated by Gris Grimley. This was a fun time. It's not higher up on my list just because it's not like a very comprehensive collection of Edgar Allan Poe. It's 4 stories. It's The Black Cat, The Mask of the Red Death, Hop Frog, and The Fall of the House of Usher. I really enjoyed the illustrations. They're very Tim Burton-esque, sort of gothic cartoon style. I really enjoyed it. I think I read it in about an hour, and I can't really recall if this, I believe it is the original text. I don't believe the text has really been edited at all. So not much to say about this. This was a fun time. I think for me as a younger reader, when I first read this, it really got me into wanting to read more of Edgar Allan Poe, so I would highly suggest that. Really any illustrated Edgar Allan Poe collection I think is perfect, especially for like little spooky readers who maybe want to get into the horror genre. I think that, you know, Edgar Allan Poe is one of the greats, and for good reason. The next book I want to talk about was a pure nostalgia read for me. I read it for the 90s pop culture readathon again, and this was just a whole lot of fun. And that is going to be Witch Volume 1, and it just says by Disney Comics on here. Let me double check real fast because obviously there is an original artist that I cannot find, but maybe you can find on Goodreads. So this is originally an Italian comic book series by Elisabetta Neon. I really enjoyed it. It's about 5 young girls. I believe they're 13, 14. They all come together and they become guardians of the different elements, and they have to stop supernatural and other dimension forces from invading Earth. If you liked Sailor Moon, I think you would really love this too. It's kind of the same sort of pure, lighthearted fun, and just like a really good, wonderful example of like that 90s, early 2000s girl gang, girl power sort of thing going on. The characters are really wonderful. I remember reading this as a kid, and I'm so glad reading it now that it has stood up. There are obviously some technology references that are very dated in here, some cultural things like that, but just in terms of like representation and dialogue and everything like that, this holds up. I'm so grateful. I am looking forward to continuing on with this series because this is one of those books that I just kind of completely forgot existed until recently, so I'm excited to continue on. This is a very lighthearted graphic novel series that is perfect for escapist reads of this year. The next book that I read for the 90s Pop Culture Readathon was It's Just a Bunch of Hocus Pocus, and that was read a book that includes magic. For that I read The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I really enjoyed this one. This is a standalone fantasy, at least it is for now, that I think people who love the Wayward Children series will really appreciate. It takes place in a world where there are magical creatures and the government regulates them for the safety of these creatures and the safety of humans. Our protagonist is a man named Linus, and he travels to different orphanages to check up on these children and to make sure they're not threats to society. He travels to the house in the Cerulean Sea and meets a very eclectic gang of kids that seem at first glance like they would be very dangerous, very evil, including the Antichrist, and it's just a very character-heavy, lighthearted romp, also a male-male romance between two characters, just kind of exploring nature versus nurture, and some kind of, if you've ever read like the X-Men comics, some themes about that, about people born with powers and governments trying to take those powers away or control them, control the people, making them feel like they're other. I really enjoyed this. This is very lighthearted. I do think that this is a very good, I believe it's classified as an adult book, but if you primarily read YA or if you read a lot of middle grade and are looking for something that's like the next step up but still has like really wholesome middle grade sort of vibes, but with adult writing and adult main characters and more of like adult themes that you might find in like a middle grade fantasy, I'd highly recommend picking this one up because I thought this would be such a good book for that. And this is a perfect book to read right now because it does kind of delve into some tough topics, but it's very lighthearted. It has a lighthearted tone, so you never feel too sad reading this book, and I think that's a really important kind of book to put out there right now. Now the next book I'm going to talk about. This is the one where I had the most trouble trying to figure out where it should go on this list because I don't know how I feel about this book, and I don't think I'll be able to fully articulate how I feel about this book until I read the next book in the series and like get more about this world and then kind of reread this book. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tell you what that is, and that's The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. I don't know how to feel about this book. I've heard from a lot of people that this is Gladiator meets Game of Thrones, and I do agree to that to an extent. I definitely see the Gladiator themes in here. Game of Thrones, I would say the only similarities that I'd really want to draw is that Tao, our main character, has very similar motivations and some of the same arcs as Arya does. So we'll give a little caveat here. There are not as many dragons as the title and the cover would lead you to believe, but I think that there will be more of that in the rest of the series. This is hard because this world is terrible. And honestly, it reminded me of a lot of things that kind of kept me from reading a lot of high fantasy for a long time, just because no matter how good a book is, as someone who would not have a good time in that society, would not really have any options other than to get married and be someone's property, it's kind of hard to read about that and really enjoy that. Fantasy for me, especially now that I've found more of like the types of high fantasy that I love, I just don't really want to kind of waste it on really patriarchal and really negative societies like that. I feel like, you know, there's obviously so much of that in our real world that why would I enter an escapist fantasy to feel the same things? However, a big caveat between that is if there are those systems in place and the character is challenging them, or the point of the series is dismantling that system, then I will read that series, and I think that's what this is going to be. Tao is from a very low caste in the this society, and he doesn't have a lot of options other than to go and basically be a grunt in the nation's army. He doesn't want that life. He doesn't want war. He does not really want to be a part of this society. His society has been at constant war. They traveled to a different land a couple of generations ago, and they have been in a constant war with the indigenous peoples of this land, trying to take over the land for themselves. And he doesn't want any part of the constant war. He just wants to take the woman that he loves and live, you know, by themselves, just happy, calm, peaceful life. However, some events happen that make him want to take revenge for his loved ones and make him kind of want to enter into the system and really dismantle a bunch of it from the inside. So that is the premise of this first book. There's a lot of things to love about this. I love the writing style. I think it complements the world so well, and I think it is like a technique of world building in and of itself. I don't like the world. It's a very war-centric society. It's very rigid caste society. If you are born lesser, or if you were born a woman, you can't really do anything. Again, this is a very 1% take all society. So it was very frustrating to see the main character kind of go through a lot of these different things and take them for face value. But towards the end of the book, you kind of see a change in his perspective, and you see, again, I'm not going to talk about like major spoilers here, but there is a big shift in the last, not the last half, but maybe the last fourth of the book that really sets up where the series is going to go and sets up some big conflicts and big ethical, moral questions about the world, the people, the society. So I am really excited to read the next book. And so I did have a lot of issues with the world itself and how poor people were treated, how women were treated, how, you know, pretty much anyone who is not one of the nobles is treated. I think we're gonna dismantle that here, so I'm excited to read it. I really enjoy Evan Winter's writing style. I think it's really unique, really fast-paced. There is a lot of fighting scenes in here. Pretty much the first half of the book especially is one long fighting montage where Tao has to learn how to become a warrior, which is also one thing that I really appreciated about this book as well, is that Tao is not good at fighting to begin with. He can't just go and take vengeance how he wants to. He has to really work hard for it. So if you enjoy very violent war-centric fantasies with a lot of fighting descriptions, I mean, there are a lot of fight scenes in here, and there are a lot of even practice fight scenes in here. I think you're really going to love this one. I think that I'm really going to love where the series goes. So that's kind of why it's in the middle of the list, was that if this was just by itself, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much, but the writing style was excellent. And again, that last like fourth of the book just has made me really excited to see where the series is going. So that's The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. The next book I am not going to spend too much time talking about because this series gets its fair share of hype on BookTube. I feel like I don't need to like explain what it's about. That's Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I really enjoyed this. This is a lot younger than I normally like my fantasies, but I was just looking, I don't know if you can tell from a lot of the books that I've read this month, but I was looking for a couple of very light, easy, enjoyable, escapist sort of reads to read this month, just because, you know, this is like month whatever in self-isolation, and if it's not getting to you, you're a stronger person than me. But I just picked this up on a whim. I really enjoyed it. This is definitely younger than I normally read. I'd say this is really good if you're primarily like, if you know someone who is looking to move up from the age category of middle grade to young adult. I think this would be a good starter book. My sister's 13. I think this is going to be like a perfect fit for her. This is a start of a high fantasy series about Selena Sardothien, and she is an assassin, and she, in this book at least, is going to a tournament, sort of like a Hunger Games almost situation, where she's participating in a tournament to become the king's royal assassin and win her freedom back. It was predictable, yes, but it was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series, and I think it is really cool. This is the second book that I've read by Sarah J Maas. I've read this one, and I also read House of Earth and Blood, the Crescent City book #1. It's so cool seeing her writing progress from this to that. This was just a lot of fun if I was kind of rating these books based on literary sort of things. It'd probably be lower down, but honestly this brought me a lot of joy this month, so it's high up on my list as a result. The next book that I read this month introduced me to probably a new auto by author, which is really exciting, and that is going to be Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I loved this. This is getting such mixed reviews, and I totally get it. Like the title suggests, it is Gothic horror, so that's either like a genre you either really love or really hate. It's about a young woman named Noemi, and her cousin has recently been married to someone that the family doesn't really know that well. So when Noemi's father gets a very mysterious letter from Noemi's cousin insinuating that her new home situation is not the best, he sends Noemi to kind of check out the situation and see if it is actually something. And spoiler alert, like the title suggests, it is. This is a very atmospheric Gothic horror. It's very, very slow burn, and I really loved it. I really loved the description in here. It's just such a perfect mood book. I would definitely save this, if you haven't already read it, for the end of September, beginning of October, because it definitely has such a wonderful atmosphere that got me so excited to really read a ton more horror and other books like that with a heavy, spooky atmosphere. This was really, really good. Again, like I said, it's very slow burn. It's not going to be for anyone, but once things start happening, they start happening. It goes from 0 to 1,000 really fast, which is really fun. I really enjoyed it. You know, the ending, this definitely feels like a horror movie in that aspect, because again, horror is my favorite genre. I love it. I love it so much. It doesn't matter if it's a book, if it's a movie, if it's a TV show. I find it very, very hard to successfully land an ending in terms of horror. I think that's just kind of one of the downsides of the genre, that very rarely, even in my favorite works of fiction, is the ending the very best part. I just think it's hard. I don't know what it is about the genre, but it's just very hard to stick a landing. This definitely, I could see some ways where it might be improved, but I really enjoyed it. Writing style is phenomenal. I really loved Noemi as a character. I'm always looking for new voices in horror and more diverse voices in horror, because it is a very white male-led genre. This is absolutely wonderful. A thing that I love about Silvia Moreno Garcia is she definitely seems to genre jump. So, you know, if you try this out and you really like the writing style but you're not a big fan of horror, she has a fantasy, she has a paranormal, she's got a lot of stuff under her belt, and it seems like everything that she comes out with is a different genre. So that's really exciting. And spoiler alert, I have another book of hers on my list that's even higher than this one, and the writing style is absolutely wonderful, and it's incredible. Just being able to write different genres like that, I think that's really, really awesome. But quite honestly, this has been one of my favorite horror books of the year, so much so that I almost want to reread this as an audiobook in October, because this book just has such a god tier atmosphere. It really builds up an atmosphere. I really like Noemi. It is also historical fiction. I should put that in there. It is in the 1950s, I believe. It is in the 1950s, so there are certain constraints on the women, but unlike a lot of historical fiction, Noemi is a very strong character, even though the times might not necessarily lend itself to being the most feminist of times. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Highly recommend if you're looking for a book to put on your radar for this spooky season, Mexican Gothic. For sure. The next book I'm going to talk about is also one of my most anticipated releases, and also one that I've noticed has been getting a lot of mixed reviews. A lot of people think it's this author's best work ever. A lot of people think it's his worst work ever. I really enjoyed it. It's high up on my list, obviously, and that is going to be Survivor Song by Paul Tremblay. This is crazy. I even put in a post-it note at the beginning of this book, and I said, reading this for the first time during the COVID-19 pandemic was a choice. Paul Tremblay got a lot right about how the US would handle a pandemic. Page 226 and of 225 are crazy accurate. So I'm going to try and read that segment for you. So slight spoilers if you don't want to hear like an entire passage of this book, but I think one of the most horrifying things about this book is clearly it was written before COVID-19 happened. And so the scariest things are seeing kind of what happens in this book that's actually happened in real life. It's a very scary situation of kind of reality and fiction blending. So again, slight spoilers if you don't want to hear a passage from this book. In the final tally of what will be considered the end of the epidemic, but not to be clear, the end of the virus, it will burrow, digging in like a nasty tick, it will migrate, and it will return, all but encouraged and welcomed in a country where science and forethought are allowed to be dirty words, where humanity's greatest invention, the vaccine, is smeared and vilified by narcissistic, purposeful fools, the most dangerous kind, where fear is harvested for fame, profit, and self-esteem. There's a group chat in the beginning of this with some doctors and some nurses talking about how ill-prepared they are, how they don't have enough PPE, how they don't have enough equipment to handle this pandemic, and they don't have enough equipment to handle the amount of people coming in. Those are the scariest parts to me as an American living through COVID-19 and seeing how in a lot of ways, unfortunately, this doesn't even get all the horrors of what's happening in our society right. It's a little too optimistic, which is scary when a horror book is more optimistic than society in a lot of ways. This is Paul Tremblay's take on the zombie fiction genre. It's not zombies in here, it's just a very fast-acting rabies virus. Before this book, I thought I was kind of over the whole zombie thing just because ever since The Walking Dead, I just feel like they've been saturated in horror media. This is really good. I really enjoyed it. There is also a incredible cameo with characters from Disappearance at Devil's Rock. So while I don't think you need to have read that book to really enjoy that book, I think there is at least a 10-page segment where it really won't hit you as much as it would had you read that book, because you do really get to know the characters in Disappearance at Devil's Rock. So read that one before you read this one if you do have a choice. I love Paul Tremblay. He has not steered me wrong ever. I really enjoyed all of his books. Honestly, I think A Head Full of Ghosts is probably still my favorite of his works so far, but this was really good. And it deals with like a lot of very bleak things, but at the end you do see like a light at the end of the tunnel, and I thought this one was one that was done really, really well. I highly enjoyed it. Again, I don't know if I would suggest this for first-time readers of Paul Tremblay, just because of, like, that cameo thing kind of builds layers that long-time readers will appreciate more, but this is like the best kind of zombie story I've read in a really long time. And even though, just as a rule of thumb, I haven't really wanted to read anything about pandemics in this pandemic, I'm really glad I made the exception for this book because it was a really wonderfully written piece of fiction. And honestly, I did not get scared in this so much as really contemplate kind of life and morality. The main relationships that are explored in this book are like found family or really close friend relationships, which I thought was wonderful, because usually I feel like when you're dealing with zombie fiction, you are exploring family, like flesh and blood family relationships, so I really liked that as well. The two main characters in here are longtime best friends, so highly, highly, highly recommend this one. I absolutely loved it. I am looking forward to, in a couple of years, revisiting this, and it'll be really interesting in seeing just how much, when I read it, really impacted my feelings towards this book and how deeply some of its contents hit me. The next book that I want to talk to you guys about is Certain Dark Things by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. This is my second book of hers that I have read. I loved it. This is a vampire story, and this is vampires done right. I listened to the audiobook. I really enjoyed it, and a fun thing that I learned about this one is that it's actually been out of print for a couple of years now because the original publisher has gone out of business, but it is getting reprinted next year, so I'm really excited to pick this one up. This is about a young vampire named Atul, and she is trying to escape from Mexico City and her surrounding area. Her family has been in a vicious feud with another vampire clan, and that is another thing which I think is really fun about this book, is that there are several different types of vampires, and depending on where they originate, it's very clearly inspired by a lot of different mythologies, because if you look at different civilizations, the vampire is always there, but just depending on which culture you're looking at, the basis of the creature is different, and that's what I think is really, really cool. Atul and her vampire vampire subspecies are based on Aztec mythology and culture, so that's really cool. So there are a lot of different kinds of vampire and vampire lore in this, which is really wonderful. There's a bunch of feuds between the different types of vampires and like human gangs as well. It's essentially a alternate universe where in the 1970s we all realized that vampires do exist, so there are like laws against them, task forces against them. There are certain places in the world that are better to live in because vampires are more enforced and hunted. So that was really cool to read. One of our main characters, Domingo, is a young street kid who doesn't have a lot going for him. He meets Adel and is just so starstruck. It's like love at first sight. He reads all of these vampire comics and vampire books and really just wants to help her. He wants to help her get out of Mexico City. He wants to be like her white knight, but also her friend. He thinks she's really pretty, and it's basically insta-love on his part. Adel understands that she needs a human to help her navigate some things, so they kind of enter into a very reluctant partnership, which turns into a friendship, which is just really fun because I feel like usually it is a male vampire and a human woman, and there's a kind of sexual dynamic in here. There is a slight romance in here, but it's so pure and awkward and wonderful because Domingo has like this hero worship for Adel, and she's kind of like, you're just a human, I just want to be friends, you're just helping me. It's beautiful. There's also a really good dog in here. My only complaint with this one is that I just wanted it to be a little bit longer, and I do think Sylvia Moreno Garcia at this point in time only read standalones, which is kind of a bummer because I definitely wanted to see more from this world. I think the vampires were done really, really well. Every single character in here is morally gray, and I thought it was really cool to explore vampires where there's a bit of humanity in them, but they're clearly not human, and just kind of exploring different shades of morally gray characters was really cool. The next book that I read this month was Girl, Serpent and Thorn by Melissa Bashardust. This one started off as a cover buy for me. I didn't really know anything about it except for YA snake and these roses graced the cover. It says sometimes the princess is the monster, and we had a morally gray bisexual main character. So I purchased it. This is a standalone fantasy inspired by Persian mythology, and it was absolutely wonderful. Again, much like certain dark things, my only complaint about this one is I wish it were a bit longer because there's definitely a part in the book, I'd say like halfway through, where the quest turns into something completely different and all of your perceptions get changed. And it's a very large cliffhanger slash something just changes everything about the book. Changes the stakes, changes some of the characters, everything. And I honestly think you could have fleshed those two parts out and made this at least a duology. But, you know, if the only bad thing that I have to say about a book is that it could have been longer and I wished I had more time in the world, that's a great book in my opinion. I really enjoy this one. Soraya is a morally gray main character. She is a part of the royal family, but she was cursed as a young child and she is poisonous to the touch. This is considered a very evil thing in her culture, and if they would find out about it, it would potentially be something to cause the people to question the royal family's right to rule, because if she was cursed and has this very evil thing about her, then the family might be evil, if you know what I mean. So she is really searching for some answers to this. She obviously does not want this curse. She would like some human contact because she's been locked away in a tower, very Rapunzel-esque, and forced to kind of watch everything from a distance. And one day her brother returns from his travels. He has a demon that he has captured, and this demon is locked away in the palace dungeons. This demon may hold all of the answers to curing Soraya of her curse, but at what cost? So this was really, really good. Again, there is a morally gray sort of love triangle. I hesitate to say love triangle, but there is a love combobulation in there. A lot of it is sapphic. Again, Soraya is a bisexual main character. This was just absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed the world building. I really enjoyed just kind of Soraya's character growth. And this very much, the prose feels like a fairy tale. It starts in a traditional Persian way with a twist. So the prologue starts, stories always begin the same way. There was and there was not. There's possibility in those words, the chance for hope or despair. So from the very beginning, this definitely reads like a fairy tale, and that was really cool to read, and I highly enjoyed this. Now the last book was my favorite book that I read this month, and it was also the only book that I didn't complete this month, so I feel like that's kind of cheating a little bit, but also this is a reread of one of my favorite books of all time. So it is a reread of one of my favorite books of all time, and that's It by Stephen King. This is my first time annotating it. I have never actually annotated a single book except for in high school forever ago, and I didn't like that, but I am enjoying annotating for my own enjoyment. So if you know it, you know it's over 1,000 pages. I'm about halfway through, but I did want to include it in this reading wrap-up just because I did talk about it a lot in my weekly reading vlogs for this month, so just gonna close the page on that. So even though I do have quite a bit, this is just the dust jacket, I have it in the other room. I am going to be finishing it in the month of August. July was really when I wanted to kind of discuss it, wrap it up. There's not really a lot to discuss just because I feel like it is one of King's most known works. I feel like most people, especially with the new movies that recently came out, kind of know the premise, but it is about a group of misfit kids who come together to fight an evil in their small town, and then years later they are all adults and they have to come back to defeat that evil for good. I just love it. And one of the reasons why it has been taking me so long, I think I started at the very beginning of this month, and I still haven't finished it, is just because I've been really enjoying taking my time. That's one of the reasons why I did decide to annotate it this time around, and just really enjoying all the character work. I love it. It's a chunker. I don't know if you can tell from some of my complaints of books in this video, but I love big tomes, and I absolutely love it. So it's one of my favorites, if not my favorite Stephen King book. It's just one of the books that whenever people just ask for like a short list of my favorite things in fiction, just especially with the new movies and just kind of like all the lore about it and the characterization themselves, it's just so easy to become a fan of the story and the characters. They're wonderful. So yeah, that was my favorite book that I read this month, one of my favorite books of all time, just in general. And that is my very long July wrap-up. I feel like I've been sitting here and filming forever, so hopefully this isn't too long for you guys. I am looking forward to August so much, just because I know I mentioned at the beginning of July that July really starts the spooky season for me, but August especially. There's the Summerween readathon going on, which my TBR for that will be up soon. I'm so excited to participate. It's my kind of readathon, and I do read horror all year round, but I am really excited to really focus on the genre with these next couple of months. I'm really excited for fall to be here, even though with this year there's not a lot of demarcation of seasons. It's just kind of, we were inside in winter, we were inside in summer, we're gonna be inside for most of fall, at least if you're in the United States. So I am back to work on a limited schedule, so my reading time will be decreasing, but that's okay. Maybe my wrap-up for August will be less lengthy, but if you got to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe for more content from me. I will catch y'all in my next video. Bye!